Hello. In this module, we're going to be going over human subject research for language model-based applications. Um, we're going to be covering a lot of topics in this module in a very short amount of time. It's sort of a whirlwind overview. The goal is just to summarize practical advice on measuring the impact of your work on people. So I just want to emphasize that each of these subjects is like a course in its own right, and we'll just be kind of glancing over each one. There's a lot of links to further readings within the slides themselves. So if you're interested in following up, you can click on those links, read the various articles and blog posts and such. Okay, so we'll start with some motivation and a few examples of how human subject research relates to language modeling. Then we'll talk a bit about ethics and IRB, and then I'll go over some survey design basics, and then others in the course staff will talk about conducting interviews, randomized control trials, and then also various platforms and tools and resources that are available to help conduct human subject research. So here's my motivational slide on human subject research. Um, Sometimes we look at the data set, the training data that goes into a language model or some other machine learning algorithm, and we just see it as a bunch of undifferentiated data. One point I'd like to make is that every data set, at least every data set that we use in language modeling, is ultimately full of people. And so, while this looked like noise, this is actually a photo of one of the largest human subject experiments ever. About 500,000 people who convened in New York in 1969 for the Woodstock Music Festival. And it's important to know that what looks like a crowd is actually a collection of people. Each person has their own story and their own personality, their own history. And I bring that up because it's just actually really easy to forget that when we work with what we call data sets, where the data comes from. So for language models, the data that we train the language model, the sort of so-called pre-training, is on text or speech that was created by people. Um, the fine-tuning of language models, such as the data that goes into the RLHF that more recent models use, those come from people expressing their preferences. Our evaluation sets are based on human-based annotators, people who label the data to determine whether the language model is accomplishing some task. And then, of course, people like you and me decide which applications we're going to create with language models. Ultimately, we're creating the applications for people, so people use the applications, and those users are affected by the applications we create. And importantly, not only are the users affected by the applications, but potentially other people too. Um, so when you build an application, think about this entire stack of people and the interrelationships between them, and think about how they're being served and possibly harmed by the work. So broadly speaking, human subject research describes studies in which real human beings are affected or observed. We call the studies in which they're affected interventional studies, and the studies in which they're observed observational studies. There's a wide array of different kinds of human subject research. It varies by a few different dimensions like scope, method, and scale. And so we're going to talk about a few of those dimensions now. I think an important dimension to think about for language model based applications is the scope dimension. And what I mean by scope really is how close to the language model itself are we talking about. So and we go all the way from the sort of most micro stuff like intrinsic language model evaluation to the broadest and farthest reaching stuff, impact studies. I'm going to motivate these different scopes with a hypothetical application. Actually, probably more than a hypothetical application at this point, because I'm sure that someone's created a chatbot for lawyers already. But suppose we have a chatbot for lawyers. It may use a language model such as GPT-3 or GPT-4, and we could ask the question, like, how well does that language model do the basic language model task of predicting the next word? We saw this metric, so-called perplexity. We saw this metric in the very first lecture of the course. But this is basically an application independent measure of just how good the language model is. So we have nothing to do with the chatbot use case at this point. And then a broader scope would be a task-specific benchmark eval. So in the case of the chatbot for lawyers example, that could be like, how well does it write factual and fluent legal briefs? So I think in our third module, was it, where we discussed the holistic evaluation for language models paper, basically all of the metrics that were described in that paper would fall under this scope. Then the next two scopes here are really about the interactivity when you deploy the application to users. So if you wanted to answer questions like how do the users of the chatbot actually write good legal briefs with it, then you might use some of the Haley framework that we just heard about from Mina Lee's lecture. Those would be sort of an appropriate set of appropriate paradigm to consider for just the application level evaluation. And then going further, we might, as people start to use the application, look at longer term sort of longitudinal sort of measures of the usage, like do lawyers adopt it into their actual workflows? And then going even broader, it's like, or even larger in scope, over time, we might see that law firms change the way they hire as a result of this new capability. Going all the way to the sort of societal implications. How does having this change the justice system? So broadly speaking, natural language processing people look at intrinsic LM evals and maybe the task-specific evals. Human-computer interaction researchers might look at the next few levels. And then the later levels are really the domain of social scientists. Although, of course, all three kinds of researchers might do all three kinds of evaluations. So now, having talked a little bit about scope, let's talk about the type or method. And again, we're dividing the world into interventional and observational kinds of human subject research. So under interventional, I've listed randomized controlled trials, which are sort of the gold standard of science, what almost everyone thinks of when you think of interventional. We'll learn about these later in this module. But in a randomized controlled trial, and I've highlighted this example from I think that Zhang and Noi, which was about this article, which I think was on the reading list about evidence for productivity effects of generative AI. They did a randomized controlled trial where they took different kinds of white collar, like knowledge workers, and had some of them do their tasks with a chatbot and some of them not do their tasks without a chatbot, and then ask questions about how they felt about the task. They measure the time that it took them to do the task and then ask them questions like, are they worried about replacement? Are they excited about the enhancement that they got from using the tool? And then what's their overall optimism about AI? And so this is one chart from the paper which shows the results of this randomized controlled trial, showing that the people who received the treatment, that is, who used the chatbot, we're more worried about being replaced, but also excited about the enhancements and also more optimistic. So A/B experiments are really just a industry jargon for randomized controlled trials, usually run in in a live web service or an app or something. And so we might run an A/B experiment within a chatbot where we take some of the users and we change the behavior of a feature in some way for them. So the paper that I've chosen to highlight for this category, which you can click on and read if you're interested, is fairly recent, I think a couple of years ago, pre-ChatGPT, but understanding the user experience of customer service chatbots. This asked about different user experience design choices for chatbots and how they impacted the preferences of users. And so one of its findings was that if you give people buttons to reply, instead of making them type free text for every response to the chatbot, it improves the how pleasant the app is to use, the so-called hedonic quality, and how useful they found it without having a significant impact on how much they anthropomorphized the application. So that's an example of like a randomized control trial sort of embedded in a running application. A/B experiments are famously used at large scale, like tech companies like Google and Facebook, to determine which ways to modify their service to appeal to users. So now just going through the observational study types quickly. Surveys, which I'll be talking about in a second. Surveys are probably the most common way to collect observational data for research experiments. The paper that I've chosen to highlight is a recent survey about teachers and students and their how much they've embraced ChatGPT. It was taken in February, so it's already probably out of date, but it was about 1,000 teachers. Actually, was it teachers and students? Thought that this was okay. N equals 1,002. I'm not sure how that broke out by teachers and students, but they asked teachers how much they were using ChatGPT and what aspects of their job they were using it for, and they came up with some findings. Like, I think surprisingly, they all mostly already knew about it and were reported using it even as early as February, and they were even using it for things like coming up with lesson plans and such. Interviews are a sort of heavier weight, harder, more expensive way to gather, slower and usually more expensive way to gather data, but very, very valuable because you can control, obviously you can change an interview in progress. So the study I've chosen to highlight in this category was about customer service chatbots and how people, what factors led to their success or failure. And so one of their findings, it was a fairly small scale study, just 13 people. One of their findings was that I think several people mentioned that they were excited to use the chatbots because they were technical themselves and wanted to kind of like use things that were futuristic. User studies are kind of like extended interviews conducted with respect to an application in the field. And the study I've chosen to highlight here is also about chatbots. It's also fairly small scale, like we just talked to about 16 people and had them use various chatbots and came to the conclusion, I think most of the users expressed different kinds of frustrations. And I should point out that this is from 2018. So it's when chatbot technology was relatively primitive by today's standards. Also under the observational category, sometimes broken out separately into the sort of like analysis category, is this correlational study. So in this case, the researchers, and these are some MIT researchers, I believe, they looked at data that already existed. In particular, there was a corpus of eye tracking and reading times by word for different data sets. They took that data and then they ran some recent suite of language models on the text from those data sets to measure different measure how predictable the words were according to the language models versus the eye tracking and reading time related measures, which had already been established. And doing that, they found that the models, like more advanced models, the more predictable a word, the faster people read them. It's sort of one finding that's kind of held up again and again. And this study examined how the predictive power of the model relates to how good that reading time prediction is, and what facets of the model, like does it use syntactic information, is it a transformer based model or an n-gram model, those kinds of things. So this was observational because they didn't have to ask any new people to answer any questions. They could just use existing data. Okay, so next section, I want to talk very briefly, far too briefly, about ethics, because for the project portion of this course, you may need to you will definitely need to consider ethics, and you may also need to file with your institution's IRB in order to get approval for the project, and I'll explain what that means. First of all, I guess if I'm going to say one thing about ethics, I'll point to the Belmont report, which was a report from a commission that was convened in the late 1970s in response to a lot of serious ethical lapses by the US government in how human subject research had been conducted. Most notably the Tuskegee scandal. The Belmont report outlined a bunch of outlined 3 principles of human subject research that it named: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So I'll go over these in turn. Respect for persons is really about respect for autonomy or personness. The respect for persons, which is probably the the most serious violation from the Tuskegee study, is basically that you must require that people have autonomy in the decision about whether to take place in the study or not, and that gets it can be especially problematic if the population you're studying have so-called diminished autonomy. So, for example, prisoners or children. And there has to be informed consent so that the people who are in the study know that they're in the study and make an informed choice to do so. The principle of beneficence, 2 things. One is do no harm, should be pretty obvious. Although, should say sometimes, you might think that like a language model experiment can't really do any serious harm since it can't punch you in the face. But as I think we've, as I think we'll see later in the course, and maybe we've seen a few examples of so far, there are many real harms that can arise from the way that language models are integrated in an application that you might study. Sorry. So take the do no harm thing seriously. Also related, the other side of that coin is that research should be about maximizing benefits. There has to be a clear reason, a clear reason to do research on something that results in a benefit for as many people as possible. Now, related to that is the justice principle, which is 2-pronged. the way that research subjects should be are selected should be just and equitable, and then the distribution of the benefits of the research should be broad and fair. So the idea of an institutional review board is any institution that conducts what meets the definition of research needs to assure that the research that's being conducted by the researchers in the institution are protecting the rights and welfare of the humans participating in that research. So every university has an IRB. Here at MIT, the IRB is called the Committee on the Use of Humans as Experimental Subjects, which, since MIT loves crazy acronyms, everyone calls CUIs. So if you go to CUIs at MIT.edu, you'll see all the information about the Belmont Report. You'll see information about MIT's IRB and its various institution-specific nuances. And then you'll also find a link to this thing called CUIs Connect, which lets you submit a protocol for approval. So this is just an example on the subject of respect for persons and autonomy. This is an example of the informed consent form from the Noy and Zhang study, where they studied the effect of ChatGPT in the knowledge economy. So you will typically, if you have any kind of like an online survey, you'll have something like this, which says the reason for being for the survey, like this survey is part of a research study conducted by, et cetera, and that your participation is voluntary. You can withdraw at any time. It's also contact information in case people have questions. If you're going to make the survey public, you have to say so, et cetera. So all of the kind of details of informed consent, you can find examples of on the CUIs site. When you submit an application, a protocol for review in CUIs, there's a few different categories. If it's a benign intervention, it could be an analysis of existing data or something where there's no personally identifiable information, that's PII, or otherwise minimal risk, like most surveys fall into this category. Then you can file for exempt review. Exempt review, basically you submit a form, your PI approves it, and then you're good to go. Surveys that involve deception or embarrassment or surveys that involve children do not fall under this category, or they may not fall under this category. And then certain categories, like if you're studying prisoners, they never fall under this category. Expedited review is the next level up, and that's like where there's some minimal intervention, but maybe it's kind of less clear whether it involves deception or not. And then if it's probably none of the projects associated with this course would need full committee review, but those are heavier weight things where there's a real possibility of there's some real risk, and those are reviewed less frequently, like synchronously every month by the IRB. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about observational methods. I'm going to cover the section on surveys, and then I think Hope will talk about interviews, and Suyash about randomized controlled trials. So surveys. Surveys are useful for assessing people's opinions, behaviors, experiences. Very widely used tool. They're very easy to create online and distribute them on the internet to large and geographically dispersed populations that you can control more or less for different demographic variables. They usually have low or benign impact on the subject. One downside with surveys is that there are many sources of bias. you can never create a survey that, can never completely know the subject that you're surveying. And so, because you're not there in the room with the person. So as a result, you have to state questions, which whether the questions are open-ended or closed-ended or whatever form they are, there's sources of bias in the way they're written, and there's sources of bias related to who will and be able to answer them. So I've linked from this slide a few different resources on survey design. I think the Pew Research one, oh, I'm sorry, I think the Harvard's tip sheet is probably the most straightforward and comprehensive one. The Pew Research one is very fun to read as well. So I recommend these two resources. So just for my survey example, I'm going to talk about that Noe Zhang paper on ChatGPT in the workplace. So their research question was, what kinds of professionals benefit the most and the least from exposure to ChatGPT in terms of satisfaction, efficacy, and productivity? So the research question has some independent variables, namely the professionals, and then some outcome from dependent variables in the self-reported satisfaction, efficacy, and productivity. And so I've highlighted the independent variables in green, and the dependent variables in yellow. So the surveys ask questions that address both of those classes. So several questions, standardly, every survey will have some set of questions asking about demographics, like are you employed, what's your income, possibly what's where are you, maybe and other identity questions. They also ask these objective measures, like how long have you been on the job, and objective measures like how long have you been on the job, and then subjective measures like how good do you think you are at different things, and how familiar are you with existing software. And then after the ChatGPT people had kind of used ChatGPT to do their work, and after the non-ChatGPT people had just gone about and done their work the normal way, both groups of people were then asked these yellow questions, like how much did you enjoy doing the task, how effective did you feel while you were doing it, and how long did it take you? So broadly speaking, the kinds of questions you see on surveys can be open-ended questions or closed-ended questions. An open-ended question is one where you can type in any answer or number. And a closed question would be one where there's some small fixed set of choices that you can make. Sort of a subtype of closed-ended questions would be that are very common in surveys, especially where you're asking for attitudes, opinions, or scale questions where you have a small number of possible answers, like on a scale of 1 to 5, how realistically does this task imitate real tasks that managers do? So these kinds of questions have different kinds of biases. I just want to take 20 seconds to talk about those kinds of biases. There is this framework called Total Survey Error Framework, which you can read about from that link, which describes the overall, the idea of TSE is like, how can I design a survey to maximize data quality given some budget? And data quality is related to the amount of error we can expect. And then error is a sum of two different kinds of error: representation error and measurement error. Measurement error is about where, what errors come from not asking the right set of people. And then measurement error is about the biases and how we ask them. So examples of representation error are like sampling bias is the most obvious one. So for example, if I conducted a survey of Twitter users and had them answer some question about their usage of ChatGPT, it would not be representative of a different population, say the population of MIT students, because Twitter users are some very small subset of the world. And it's a very different looking subset, distributionally different in many different ways from MIT students or almost any other population you could think of. So that's a kind of sampling bias. And then non-response bias, maybe not everyone, that I solicit to answer a survey will answer the survey at all, and some of them who do answer the survey may not answer every question. So those are kind of like different kinds of representation bias. And then measurement bias comes from the way that questions are asked. And I want to give just a bunch of examples of that in these links, but I would want to give one kind of subtle example from 20 years ago, when people in the US were asked about their opinions about same-sex marriage and same-sex civil union. And depending on the order in which those two questions are asked, the surveyors got different results. So you can see if you first asked about civil unions and legal agreements, you got a lower number than if you first asked about same-sex marriage and then asked about legal agreements, because the respondents were sort of primed to think about a larger range of possibilities. Okay, so that's my discussion of surveys, and we'll move on to interviews now. And so Hope will be talking about that.